I've known Pam for many years. Her mother was our next door neighbour for many years. And Pam's someone I really wanted to speak to Zonta Says Now since Carol started the group, because our interests align so closely. So Zonta Says Now, trying to create a gender equal, sustainable world, primarily through educating girls and women, advocating for women's rights, and advocating for their participation in decision-making and inspiring more female leaders. We know that impacts of climate change, such as flood, drought, storms, natural disasters, have an increased impact on the poor, the hungry, the least educated, and that 2/3 of that group are actually women. That in times of scarcity and difficulty, it is the women who have to often work out how the family is going to survive. We also know that the women are also often in the most or the least secure jobs, and that when there's a negative impact on their economy, often caused by the effects of climate change, then they are the first ones to lose their jobs. And Pam has enormous practical experience in a lot of those areas. Pam is, I suppose, still Australian, I'm not sure about Australian citizenship, but lives in Finland now and has worked in the development area for over 34 years now. So Pam started out as a veterinarian, and I do remember when you were a vet too, and then went to study social science and a PhD in development studies. So when she was working as a veterinarian, she went to Nicaragua as an environmental volunteer and solidarity worker, and that sort of started her on a new path towards development work. So Pam has now worked over 34 years in lots of different countries, in projects ranging from agriculture, forestry, natural resources, renewable energy, and a huge one called WASH, which is water supply, sanitation and hygiene. And gender equality, Pam's an expert in gender, women's empowerment, and a lot of her work has a human rights-based approach, and that's where we're quite aligned with how Zonta works in the world. So Pam's worked extensively in Nepal, and in fact, when I did some work in schools in Nepal, Pam was an absolutely brilliant person to have, to be able to email or call and say, what do I do now? What's the best thing? So that work in Nepal has seen her actually deal with the impacts of climate change on women, and seen that women have suffered the most from those climate change issues. So, and seen how important, and she knows how important it is that women are involved in that decision making in those sort of issues, and has actually helped that happen. So the projects in Nepal have produced very strong gender results, and really focused on that equal participation of women. And Pam's going to tell us a bit about all this type of work today, and also she's going to talk a bit about a program in Nepal called Dignified Menstruation Management, which actually kind of aligns with what we're talking about. So Pam has also been involved in not only setting up projects but also evaluating them in a number of countries such as Vietnam, Mozambique, Laos, etc. And so she works with the governments of Finland, with Nepal, with the EU, with the World Bank. She's authored a number of documents on gender. She's participated in a lot of studies about gender and how to support women. So I think Pam is the perfect person to talk to us today.
Okay, thanks very much for the glowing start, Sue. Okay, let me see. I will share my screen. If I can find it, there it is. Okay. And there. So are you seeing my screen now?
Yep.
Are you seeing my notes as well, or just the...
Yes, we are seeing some of your notes. So
that's funny. How do I get
you
rid of
go
that?
to slideshow.
I think I'm on. Oh, no, there we are. Okay.
Yep, that's right.
Okay. Now I've lost my notes, but that's all right. I'll survive. And I'll just move your pictures up so it's not in the way. Okay, great. So, yeah, my name's Pam White, as Sue presented me, and I thought I'd try and cut. There's so many things I could talk about, frankly, but I'm trying to focus a bit on women and climate change to start with, and then a bit more on the menstruation issues towards the end. And I don't really need to say how I got to be walking over this bridge, because Sue's already told the group. So this is just very briefly the history of the Finnish aid in the water sector in Nepal, as I'm sort of focusing on that country. So the yellow area here, that was a project that our company started with Finland. It was the first Finnish project in Nepal that started in 1990. And then there was another one which was looking at environmental management and administration. Then this project on the left with the green is there are horrible acronyms in this, I'm afraid. But anyway, this is RVWRMP, so the Rural Village Water Resources Management Project. And then this green, paler green one, which was the Rural Water Supply and Sanitation Project of Western Nepal. Plus Finland supported UNICEF and some NGOs as well. So I'm mostly talking about the last two projects. They were large bilateral projects, is what we say. In fact, the one in the far west of Nepal also eventually had EU funding, but initially it was only Finland and the government of Nepal. And they're in quite remote areas in the hills mostly. One of the projects had some work on the Terai, on the flatlands, but mostly we're up in the mountains, as you can see. And that meant a lot of walking to get there, certainly initially. The last couple of years, they've built a lot of roads, but prior to that, you had to walk a very long way to get to these places. And you can see it's pretty tough conditions that people are living in there. Fairly small plots of land, very reliant on rainfall normally. There's very little irrigation possible. And they've got to carry in whatever they produce. Makes it very difficult to do things like agricultural value chains, because it's so difficult to produce the products in a cheap manner with very few inputs and then carry them out. Makes it not very viable. And I've just, as some of you heard, I've just been in India doing an evaluation for IFAD, one of the UN organizations, and it was interesting to see how many subsidies the Indian farmers get, whereas the Nepali farmers really don't. So they're struggling to compete with the big neighbors of China and India. And, you know, it can be very harsh terrain. You can see here, I mean, the picture on the left, I don't know if your screen's big enough, but there's a tiny little bit of cultivation in the middle of that totally bare hillside,
Yeah,
and all the paths crossing over where people have walked. And on the right, you know, there's a lot of landslides. So you can see this mule train picking its way across the mule train on the right-hand side. But it also slows down the work. Whenever you travel in the mountains in Nepal, if you're in a car, you can always count on the road being stopped by bulldozers, because they'll be clearing landslides at any time, particularly at this time of the year when the rains are starting. So discrimination and exclusion. Discrimination in Nepal is pretty broad. So there's a whole lot of issues like touchability and untouchability, ethnicity, landlessness. A lot of people don't have any land. Caste, of course, so Dalits, untouchable caste, and then the sort of more advantaged castes. Gender, obviously, and I mean, in our project, we were really only dealing with male, female. We didn't get into other issues. It was just too complicated otherwise. But I would say probably most LGBT people, if they've got a chance, get out and get to cities, because there's not much opportunity in a village. Then there's issues of religion. Mostly people are Hindu in our project area, but there's also some Muslims. Menstruation status, disability, etc. I mention menstruation status because we normally talk about gender being a social construct. So in the sense that it's not just a biological male-female. But personally, I think Nepal is the perfect example of that because it changes according to your situation. Now, normally a Brahmin, advantage caste woman, would be higher in the pecking order than a Dalit or untouchable caste man, like this. But as soon as that Brahmin woman menstruates, she's down below the man. So it changes all the time. Nobody wants to touch her at all. So, and all these things have a lot of implications for access to water. And exclusion was one of the main reasons for the civil war that was in Nepal from mid-90s, shall we say, till about 2005. So it all started in the west of the country, and it was mainly to do with exclusion, caste, etc. And therefore, dealing with those issues has been really important in peace building, and we've had a lot of success in that, of using, for instance, a fairly neutral topic like water to bring people together, particularly straight after the war. For people to come together and plan a water scheme was really important because it was often the first time these people were back talking to each other after fighting, and they could discuss something that was a neutral thing together and plan it together. And it was a really successful way of working on those issues. We also talk about, for instance, in the gender issues like menstruation, but also the elderly and disability. Because if you try to talk about disability, often people get a bit anxious. There's a lot of discrimination about disability. But, talking about access to toilets for people with disability, it's often the same sort of issues as access to toilets for frail elderly people. And I quickly discovered that was a useful that you could talk about. I could ask people, have you got a person with a disability in your household? And they would get very anxious. But if you say, let's talk about frail elderly in the household, and everyone got interested because there's always frail elderly living in the household, and everyone knows they'll get old one day. So then it was a good way to talk about those issues. Now, again, lots of acronyms. So we had this disaster risk management and climate change adaptation. So due to the geographic situation, as I showed in those early slides, disasters are always there. So we have a problem of too much water or no water, and landslides as a result, and often human interference. So as soon as we had elections in 2017, all the local governments, the new governments, bought bulldozers and started making roads. Now, I totally understand why, because, it's very hard if you've got to walk into these communities. But on the other hand, they did a lot of damage to water collection points, even running over our pipes sometimes. And so there was really a need to deal with that very quickly. And the rock and soil is very crumbly in Nepal. And so it's very easy to have it collapse and fall down the hill. And you see it everywhere, lots of little landslides and sometimes very large ones. Climate change adaptation, we don't really concern ourselves too much on mitigation. I mean, we've had renewable energy project activities there, but the reality is the amount of greenhouse gas mitigation that we can carry out is very minor, and compared to the amount of greenhouse gases being produced in other countries. So we think it's more important to deal with the adaptation to what's happening with the climates. There's decreasing rainfall in general in the west of the country, and as in most countries, it's more erratic, it's less predictable and very intense at times. So it might come in a very short period, very, very heavy rain, and then not the rest of the time. So everybody has just planted their crops and then the new rain doesn't come. Also, we've had things like the last couple of years, there's been rains late in October, which normally they don't then, it should have stopped by then. So there's been heavy rains then. Increase in temperature in general, summers are getting hotter. Now, the mountain and high altitude areas are changing more rapidly. In some ways, it's a plus for the mountain areas. Not everything is a downside for climate change. So some of our our villages are able to grow crops that they couldn't grow crops earlier because it's warmer. So for that small group, it's actually a plus. But obviously for most people, it's not. And we're talking really hot temperatures, 40s for a long period. There's earthquakes, obviously, in Nepal. There was a very large earthquake in 2000. Well, there were two in 2015. And they're a constant sort of issue. There's background tremors, and there's always a bit of a concern of more tremors. And there's these new federal local government. So from the time of 1998, there was no elections after that time. So local governments ended in about 2002 in Nepal. And so there was a long period where there was no local governments at all. And it was only when finally the new constitution was prepared in 2015 that it was possible to hold elections at local level in 2017. So up until then, there were line ministry staff coming from Kathmandu or whatever. And it was actually fantastic as far as we were concerned when the new elections happened, because you suddenly had ownership. There were local people elected to local governments, and they were interested in and had responsibility. They weren't running away. They weren't so corrupt as, line ministry staff. They were elected. They had responsibility for local people. So that was fantastic. But in the very remote areas, it was hard to get experienced staff because they just hadn't done it before. So we had to work a lot on improving their capabilities. So, as I've said, climate change in Nepal, it's having impacts on a lot of different issues. There's household water supply. We're working on agriculture, watershed management, forests, and renewable energy are all big issues for women in particular. And climate change is definitely having an impact on the water sources. In areas where there's no project activities, you can see people queuing for water at the old traditional water sources because it takes so long for the water to trickle down. These are natural springs or gathering points. And so women had to sit there for hours. And hence the pots being left ready to go. And in most of our project areas, people were walking to springs or rivers, and they're very steep slopes. So if you're walking carrying one of those big plastic water containers with a strap around their heads multiple times a day, because it's not just the water for drinking in the household, but it's also for livestock, for instance, or for washing clothes or whatever it might be. So often people would have to be walking all day. One person from the household would walk all day long. Now, surprisingly, in these photos, they're mostly men, but in fact, the women are the ones doing the water collection usually. So that was the key point of both of our projects, was the need to get water. And, water is life. It's a great topic to work on because it's something that everybody is interested in. To be fair, the men are slightly less interested because getting the water to the house is not their business. They know it'll get there one way or the other, whether the wife has to walk all day long to do it. But, everybody needs water. So it's very good to get people focused when you're talking about water. So what we did was look at, first of all, drinking water was the priority. And related to that, you get the improved health outcomes because people can drink more, there's better hygiene. And also toilets in Nepal typically use water, and people wash with water. And so you need water to use the toilet. And if you don't have water, people don't use the toilet. They just leave it and they go back outside. So this open defecation free campaign was an important part of the project. In the first few phases of the Far West project, we were assisting households to build their own toilets and doing a lot of campaigning, but it was a problem because people didn't necessarily get the message. There wasn't so much ownership in some places. There were virtually not a single toilet in the far west of Nepal when we started. There was something like 5, I think. So, so there were a lot of construction to be done. But when the government of Nepal came on board with a national sanitation campaign, that was great. And they also said at that point that there should be no subsidies for toilets at household level. So that actually worked quite well. At first, we weren't sure how well it would be, but in the end, it worked very well in most of the areas. And so everybody was encouraged through a whole campaign, community-led total sanitation, it's called, where you sort of inspire people with a feeling of disgust, which sounds awful. And at first, we were very anxious about it because we felt like, particularly Dalit women in particular, you know, they're getting enough disgust at any time. They don't need more, but it actually worked very effectively. So you're taking the whole community out, looking at the shit on the ground, basically, and getting everybody to feel that this is really awful and it's dangerous for the family. The point being that there's no good in you building a toilet if your next door neighbour doesn't, because then still the flies are coming to the shit outside and they're washing into the water supply, etc. So you need everybody to use a toilet on every occasion. And so local governments gave, you know, rewards to particularly poor families if they were doing it, and everybody worked together. And it was a really great campaign, and basically everywhere now has a toilet, and it's a very openly discussed subject. You know, at first people were anxious about it, but now you talk about it very openly. And, you know, if you visit a village anywhere on the side of the road in Nepal, you can use the toilet. You know, you can say to the person, "Can I use your toilet, please?" And that's fine, because everyone understands it's important to use the toilet all the time. So that was a really good campaign. Then the private taps we brought in some cases. So initially everyone was using public taps, but private taps were asked for by some communities, and it was actually really successful, because then we found that they maintained the tap better and women got much more access to the tap. So just quickly, I won't go into this in much depth. Human right to water has certain categories. So there's ensuring a minimum quantity of water, and it should be continuous. So in Nepal, the figure is 45 litres per person per day. In some countries in Africa, they use the figure of only 15. That's if you're not using water for washing in the toilet. Accessible. So the Nepali standard is they should be 15 minutes maximum for the round trip to get water. It should be clean. It should be affordable. But this is a tricky point, because water isn't free. I mean, it costs to, you know, produce a scheme and to maintain it. So you need some amount of maintenance. And then acceptability. So the type of scheme, as I said, some communities wanted to have private stands, even though it's a bit more expensive and they would have to pay more. Yeah, and the location of the tap stands, we always got women involved in choosing where the public taps should be, so that they put it close to where it suited them, because if you ask men, they'd usually want to have the tap near the fields for irrigation. So we wanted to have it for domestic water, so that was important. And also doing things like sanitation and hygiene. So, you know, teaching about hand washing, building taps near toilets, etc. The standard, the human right to sanitation, is everyone has access to sanitation, which is safe, hygienic, secure, socially and culturally acceptable, provides privacy and ensures dignity. I should say all of this is built on the right to sanitation, right to water and sanitation, which was declared in the UN in 2010. And it was actually great when this happened, because Nepal was one of the signatories. And that worked really well for us, because then when we were doing this campaigning, you know, people, you know, if they said, "Oh, well, you know, that's what your you foreigners, you Finns, for instance, in our case, are saying. But we could say, no, this is actually, Nepal has signed up to this. So it's your commitment that you should be ensuring the right to water and sanitation for all people. Now, that doesn't mean straight away. It's a progressive process, but you have to show that something is being done. Yeah, I've talked about this already, more or less. Okay, so then we were also talking about water for home gardens. So while the main priority was drinking water, then if there's any excess, then, or runoff water, etc., it was important to think about home gardens. And initially, because of the transport, it was impossible to think about value chains, sort of more advanced agricultural production. But we could talk about food security and nutrition at household level. And you would think that people would be growing home gardens already, but they really weren't. I mean, most people had, for instance, maize and a winter wheat, or a bit of millet or something like that, and maybe some greens, some canola or something like that. But very few were growing vegetables beforehand. Now, that's partly because there wasn't so much water, but also sort of lack of knowledge, really. And so we, emphasised, to start with at least, the importance of even using the runoff water from the taps. If there wasn't even that much, then the water that people had done hand washing in, etc., they could use in little drip sets to have drip irrigation on fields. You could get them more and more cheaply. And this was really great. It improved nutrition. The kids loved eating the vegetables, interestingly. And we did training on nutrition at schools and with village, women's groups, etc., and ensuring, good water efficiency. And occasionally, to start with, they could, for instance, sell seedlings that they'd produced to others, or a bit of excess crops. And gradually, as the project developed, then it's moved into more commercial production with those people who could afford to. This mention of urine as fertilizer. We did a lot of work on compost, good quality compost production, because you simply can't buy commercial fertilizers in the far west of Nepal. Up in the hills, there's not enough in the whole country. But then we also introduced using human urine as a fertilizer. And I mean, urine is a great product, lots of nitrogen, some phosphorus, probably could do with a little more, and some trace minerals. Now, because of all the untouchability issues, a lot of people were anxious to start with. How awful is that? But then when they saw some comparisons as to how well vegetables grew with the human urine, they got quite excited about it. And so it became a big hit. So everywhere you'd go, you'd see containers of urine outside farming plots, where people were using the urine. And then there's all these cross-cutting criteria of human rights-based approach. So I think I probably should run through this so very quickly. But the importance of involving people, participation of everyone, access to justice, who can they complain to if there's a problem, ensuring it's good quality construction so that it's sustainable, etc. Okay, then disaster risk management. We had to really consider during all the stages of the program what the disaster potential there was. So considering also this local adaptation plan of action, which everyone theoretically has. It's not incredibly good at government level in Nepal, but it's there in theory. Doing things like protecting the sources, the water sources, so that you sort of try to stop water floods from destroying them. We had these water safety plans. So once the scheme is constructed, there has to be a plan with the user committee that they go every month and check the whole line of the water, and also talk about what's happening at household level, that you shouldn't have a dirty pot that you're putting the water in, because then it won't be very hygienic. We had very good quality construction and materials. A lot of training, probably the social aspects were most important. So the government system typically is that they contract a company to build a water scheme, and then they hand it over to the community. Whereas we said, no, we start with the community. We did a planning process where we looked at what water was available, and then there was a committee elected at community level, and then they were given a lot of training on management, on design, on ensuring it was all very inclusive. There had to be equal numbers of women and men in the committee and in the leadership, and also representative numbers of, for instance, Dalits or ethnic minorities, as in the community, and they had to think about what are the steps they're going to take to make sure the water is used appropriately, that you don't have one person who takes 90% of the water. It has to be fairly distributed. And yeah, also this water user fee collection and management, and that gives you then the ability to respond to disasters, because if there's bad storm and there's destruction of the scheme, then you have to know what to do then. The village might not be able to fix it, so then there can be a fund at the rural municipality level that the district, the whole district has contributed to repair things. We looked into insurance issues and that sort of thing. I'm definitely going to run out of time doing this. I better move it along. We did these water user master plans. So looking before we even started, we'd go into a community and look at what the whole water source provision was, what different types of waters there was, who were using it, what their wishes were, where the vulnerabilities were to climate change and disasters, etc., and making sure that we talk to everybody at local level, not just talking to the local government, but talking to the elderly, the very poor who might not get out of their houses. But we had meetings at local level. And also, for instance, having where it was clear that women were very lacking in confidence, particularly early on in the project, we would have a several days confidence building session where we'd sit down, just the women, and talk about water for a few days. So say, you're the ones who know about the water issues. Let's practice talking about them out loud. Because very often women would come to the meetings and they couldn't even say their name in public. They were so shy. So it was really important to give them the chance to practice talking about those issues in a protected sort of environment of just women, before then they could go to the community where the prioritization of the different schemes were happening, and they could say what their issues were out loud. So that was really important. We've also had things like solar power for pumping water in some areas. Normally it was gravity-fed water supply, so coming down from a higher up scheme. But if you've got a village that's above the water scheme, what do you do? Well, you have to pump the water up, and the best way to do it is solar. The only tricky thing is that in some areas we had a lot of lightning strikes, even though we were earthing everything very well, so it's slightly vulnerable, but yeah, it's good. We also did things like improved water mills, so little old-fashioned mills that have been very traditional in Nepal, but we put on better power takeoffs so that they were more efficient, or then improved cooking stoves to use less firewood. Disaster risk management training at the rural municipality as well, so that they could think about what the plans are, what they should do when there is a disaster. And here you can see just some of the activities. On the left is one of the water mills. Then the improved cooking stoves, they use about half the firewood, generally speaking. It depends. They can be somewhere between 25% less and 60% less. But they also have the benefits that they have a chimney, so that's a much better environment for the women to cook in. And they have 2 burners instead of just the traditional, open fire where you can only cook one thing at once. So the cooking time is halved. Also, you had to think about multiple uses of water. If there's enough water beyond drinking water, then you need to think about having water for irrigation perhaps, and also for livestock. You don't want the livestock drinking out of the taps, as you can see there. It's much better to build a drinking pond. And things like recharge structures. So, you know, for instance, building little dams on top of hills so the water is percolating back into the ground. Or on the left, you can see the ladies are digging what we call little recharge pits, so little holes to try to stop the water from accelerating down a bare hillside. You can dig a little pit and then plant sturdy grasses or seedlings around the pit to try to keep it there. And that way you're just slowing down the water and getting it to go back into the water source a bit more. Okay, so menstruation. Now, this was a really big issue, particularly in the Far West project I was working in, but also all over Nepal, really. So in Hindu sort of cultural traditions, I mean, I wouldn't say this is necessarily just Hinduism, but, you know, it's particularly strong. Obviously, in Judaism and other issues as well, there are issues about menstruation. So the menstruating women couldn't touch the tap or the toilet. Now, that's sort of because God is in the water. And if you're using water to use in the toilet to wash yourself, then you don't want God touching menstrual blood. So that seems to be the background of it anyway. Now, obviously, it was less of an issue before the project came along because there weren't taps and there weren't toilets. So for a long time, we had the taps, and we started to understand that that was an issue, that women couldn't go to the public tap when they were menstruating, that other women would have to collect the water and perhaps even pour it into their mouths or into their hands to drink. But the toilet issue took a long time for us to understand because, of course, there weren't toilets. So it wasn't like it was a traditional issue. It wasn't written down anywhere that menstruating women can't use a toilet. And so it took some time before we realized that that was a big issue. And the idea is that if you use a toilet when you're menstruating, you make it more dirty, which is a strange concept. But anyway, also, as you can see in this photo, we had some areas in one of the projects with a sort of intensive concentrated Muslim community. And in those communities, often menstruation was also an issue. And in those areas also, often the daughter-in-law and the father-in-law who were living in the same house weren't allowed to use the same toilet. So that was also a problem. Getting the women out to communities, to community meetings in Muslim communities is often quite difficult too. So obviously it's a big infringement of your human rights if you can't use water or sanitation, but there's also all these other issues related to that, like food. When you're menstruating, you're not allowed to drink milk or eat yogurt or curd or anything because it might make the cow sick. You're impure, you can't touch other people, you can't cook, and that means that you can't go into your kitchen. And in the more extreme areas, like most of our Far West project area, you weren't allowed to even stay in the house. So women were sent out to these tiny huts or had to sleep with the cows underneath the house when they were menstruating, and also when they gave birth, and they couldn't go to public affairs. So it's a very strong taboo, and it was probably the most difficult behavior to work on in our project area. You know, getting people to use toilets, that worked quite well. People learned that. All sorts of things, even tricky things like using the urine in the vegetable production, that worked fine. But getting people to not use, well, to not participate in life, basically, when they're menstruating is really difficult and very tenacious tradition. And part of it is because these are very remote communities. And if you break the rules and then, for instance, a child gets sick or an elderly person in your household gets sick, then you blame yourself, quite apart from everybody else blaming you as well. And everybody knows your business in the villages. So you're usually washing in public, you know, hanging up your cloths to dry. So everybody knows you're menstruating. So it's a really big problem. So as I said, they're often sent to these very unsafe shelters to sleep in, cattle sheds, whatever, and sometimes even sleeping in the open. I've got a photo of that after this. They can't eat milk or curd or many other nutritious foods during menstruation, and also for the 10 days often after they've had a child. They're often out there in these huts or in amongst the cattle, and they're not allowed to eat nutritious food. They're not allowed to touch the tap or the toilet, so they're not allowed to wash even until the 3rd day. After the 3rd day of menstruation, you shouldn't wash. So that's not very nice, and very difficult to find suitable sanitary materials. Mostly women are just using old cloths. And yeah, exclusion. So not allowed to sleep in your own bed, enter the kitchen, go in the house usually. You can't eat together. You can't go to the temple. We didn't touch those issues, but we did touch the more practical ones of sort of human rights issues. And also it became a problem that they couldn't participate in meetings. So for instance, we've said that there has to be equal numbers of women and men in user committees, or, you know, encouraging them to go to trainings and things like that. But if they're menstruating, they didn't feel they could. And it's dignity. Nobody wants to work with them. And that means that the women feel very embarrassed. They feel that, you know, they've done something wrong often. And I mean, traditionally, often people would say, oh, yeah, no, they're having a time to rest during their menstruation. But that wasn't true, because the reality is that because somebody else has to do all the cooking and the normal jobs that they'd be doing, usually the mother-in-law, then they have to do all the hard outside work. So collecting firewood, taking animals out to graze, collecting forage for the animals. And education was a biggie, because the girls were often not allowed to go to school for 4 days a month. And even now that tends to happen a bit. We've done a lot of work on that. And in most places it's working fine. But even just last year, when I was visiting a couple of the schools that we'd been working on with this, they'd had a recent issue of a sort of mass hysteria event where some girls had been crying and fainting at school. And it turned out it was because they were menstruating and they were worried that they were breaking the religious rules. And it turned out in both cases that that was a very local issue, because it was girls who were living in one sort of cluster of houses where they had to walk past a local religious leader to get to the school. And he was harassing them and accusing them all of contaminating his temple by walking past them when they were menstruating. So then there was a lot of discussion with sort of the more benign religious leaders in the communities to try and convince the problem one. And in the end, I think in both cases, the local government decided to build a new path. They were very pragmatic and just decided to build a path so the girls could go around the guy's temple. But as you can see, these are these chow huts, variation of quality. Sometimes, of course, you might have more than one woman in there at once with their children. Other times they're in there alone, and there's a lot of problems. They're dangerous. During winter in the mountains, it's very cold, so they'll often shut the door, and sometimes people light a fire, and then there's been, you know, deaths of carbon monoxide poisoning, etc. We've had people attacked by wild animals there, bitten by snakes, and even raped. Unfortunately, they're too dirty to touch, but not too dirty to rape. So they're there, and, you know, you might have some drunk guy coming home and taking advantage of the fact that the woman's there at night by herself in the hut. So we also have these other issues in Nepal, because they're doing such hard work right up until they go into labour, and then straight away after labour, they're back doing hard work again. So there's a lot of cases of uterine prolapse, really huge. And the government does a lot of work on that. They have campaigns where they go around and do like linked to schools or whatever, and they'll do surgeries on a whole lot of women at once on uterine prolapse. But it's pretty awful. And, you know, because most of the women don't want to talk about it. They're embarrassed. They don't know what it's all about. I had a meeting last year in one community, and I was talking about the issue and, you know, asking, had anyone had any sort of uterine prolapse? And, you know, I said I had a small one after my first birth. And yeah, so gradually they started to open up a bit. And one of the women said her uterus dropped right out between her legs, and she was too embarrassed to tell anyone for quite a while. Really shocking. So, but yeah, very tricky thing to work on. So we tried involving local religious leaders and doing a lot of campaigning, and some places called themselves child hut free. Although then, even then, you might have an incident. We had heard of several occasions where people said they were back staying inside their house, but then they sort of had this sort of hysteria event, basically, where they would feel anxious and faint. And so then they went out and slept outside under a blanket. So that was a real problem, because that, you know, we'd made their lives worse, not better. Anyway, so yeah, lots of work on this. The Dignified Menstruation Management campaign began, and once we had local government, this was something we could really work on. So bringing together almost all of the deputy chairpersons of the rural municipalities in our area were women. And so we brought them together for a workshop and talked about this, and they all made a declaration, and then we worked with them all to develop dignified menstruation management declarations and local directives, sort of legal policies, to ensure that there was funding and campaigning and things in the future in their areas. We had a lot of training on it, and we also had these workshops where we brought together elected women in the rural municipal council, and also employed women, so nurses, teachers, etc. And we bring them together for a workshop to talk about what are the problems for women in their municipal area, and then to think about what could be done about them and what would be possible sources of assistance. It might be our project, it might be other government projects, etc. And sort of to really plot that out and make a plan and a budget. And then we'd bring in the men from the council and get them to make a commitment to supporting these over the coming years. And then we went back annually and had a little workshop to revisit the plans and see how they were progressing, and give a bit more of a push on to getting funding for different things. And we also added disability as an issue later on.
Pam, sorry, we might have to start winding up. Yeah,
sure. Okay, so menstrual training, sanitary pads, supply chains, all sorts of issues were covered in this, and all sorts of behaviour change things. So we did things at schools, lots of campaigning, children's clubs, making reusable sanitary pads, all sorts of things. And this was a really successful thing. We got a celebrity ambassador. So this lady, Reka, is a singer and well-known. She comes from the local area, and we got her to take up the campaign, and she went around. She made a couple of songs and a video. She was so active on social media. And so it was really successful, because you had thousands of people coming to concerts to listen to her sing and then talk about menstruation issues in the area. And people really loved it. And, you know, they said that the message was getting through much better.
Yeah, that's good.
Okay.
That's great, Pam.
Yes.
That's wonderful. It's wonderful.
So, Pam, I just want to say, wow, thank you. I mean, I've seen quite a number of those problems myself, and but it's really great that the others can have an opportunity to start to understand them too, and to realise the work that people like you are doing, the support that you're giving women to cope with their changing lives and opportunities to improve them, and kind of move with the 21st century ideas too. So, and to develop their confidence in actually participating in their own world and problems. So thank you so much for being here this afternoon. And if you can, it'd be great if you could stay for a little while longer.
Sure,
to hear
no
the
problem.
next section.
That's great. Thank you, Pam. That's wonderful. I just had a quick question. How do you go for your safety when you're over there with regards to what happens if you're menstruating? Does that cause a problem? What language?
Don't ask, don't tell. we never told.
Excellent.
And it's funny because I remember being in a meeting once in one of the project areas, and there was these women, and we were discussing menstruation, and then one of the younger women was down studying in the district headquarters. And she said, when you're in the village, everyone knows your business, everyone knows you're menstruating. But when I first moved down to the district headquarters and I was menstruating the first time, and I was walking down the street and I accidentally brushed a man's shoulder and he didn't get sick. And then I realized this is nonsense. You know, he only gets sick if he knows that I'm menstruating. So that was great.
There's it all, doesn't it? That's brilliant.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Pam. We'll have to move on, and but I really appreciated the preparation and for also showing us a little bit of Finland out the window, which was
can I just say before we go on that Pam actually has worked in really well, because we were looking at disaster risk management at the last meeting, and then our area meeting I actually had Jamuna Parit Julie, who's from Nepal, and tells the story of she's just finished her doctorate, but she could not go to school until her father had asked the local community to put in a toilet.
Yeah,
wow,
definitely. Big issue.
Wow. Well, thank you again, Pam. That was just gorgeous.